What does the future hold for Nelson Greenbrier Distillery? Today we're taking a look at Nelson Bros Reserve Bourbon to find out. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Hutch, and thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the world of whiskey. So today we are taking a look at Nelson Brothers or Nelson Bros Reserve Bourbon. So I did a video a little while back on the Belle Meade Reserve Bourbon, which is a bourbon that, a lot of people have seen as one of the best, sitting there on shelves between 60 and 70 bucks for years now. It was the Nelson Greenbrier Distillery sourcing stuff from MGP, so a high rye bourbon from MGP that a lot of people loved as a sort of hidden gem or secret favorite of theirs. That product, the Belle Meade Reserve, has been pulled out of the national market. Right now, you can probably still go out and get some bottles of it. I've seen it on shelves, but eventually it probably won't be very widely available. It'll just be at the distillery in Nashville area. So in that video, which I'll link up here because I think that bourbon itself was fantastic and worth going out to get, but I talked about how Nelson Brothers was going to be releasing their own branded bourbon, something that would clearly, connect it to the Nelson Greenbrier Distillery and, of course, be their own distillate. So this is the fruit of that labor and the fruit of reviving that distillery and putting, their own product out, which I think is great. It's a little sad that great MGP-sourced stuff is, no longer in the national market. But we're here to evaluate today how good their own distillate is. And this reserve bourbon is, by all accounts, a very similar attempt to do something very similar. So it's 107.8 proof. The Belle Meade is 108.3. We'll actually probably do a little comparison here once we're done reviewing this. This stuff is a blend of straight bourbon whiskeys, which whenever you see that on a label, that means that it's at least 2 years old. The youngest stuff in here is 2 years old. I'd bet that this is probably a little bit older than that. I think this distillery has been around since 2017, or that's when they started the revival of it. So it's Tennessee. It's down in Tennessee, the distillery, though they have bourbon on here, so it's not classified as a Tennessee whiskey, but it will be interesting to see if, instead of the high rye MGP stuff, a high rye Tennessee bourbon has a little different flair to it. Pricing wise, we are looking at something that varies a little bit by state. This I picked up for $57, which is a little bit cheaper than the Belle Meade. The Belle Meade's right around $65 for me in my area in Kentucky, but for a lot of people, this will sit on shelves at around 65 bucks. I know in other, state-controlled states, that's about what it's sitting at. So this is actually going to be a fresh crack for me. I just went out and got this bottle today, but while I uncork it, I do just want to ask that if you're liking the video and the content coming out of the channel, smash that like button. Hit that subscribe button. I've actually got a goal now to try to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of 2022. So if you could hit that big red subscribe button, turn it gray, and help me reach that goal, that would be awesome. And here we go. Let's just go for it and open up this brand new Nelson Brothers Reserve. Cheers. All right, now we've got it opened up. First, just evaluating the color. Decent color. I wouldn't say it's the darkest thing I've ever seen, but it's not grainy or super light in color, that's for sure. Let's get into the nose here. Okay. Sweet. Kind of like a candied Laffy Taffy sweetness to it. So on Jack Daniel's, which is another Tennessee whiskey, especially like the barrel proof and the bonded, I get a Laffy Taffy banana kind of quality. This leans in that direction. I wouldn't say that it is quite as banana-y. It might be more like a strawberry or bubblegum kind of Laffy Taffy note, but it's definitely a candy kind of nose. And again, this isn't technically a Tennessee whiskey, but I think that comparison to a Jack Daniel's bonded or something like that is apt. Other than that, there's a little ethanol sting. It's 107.8 proof, so wouldn't, I'm not expecting some ethanol on it, but maybe a little bit of a grainy youthfulness and an ethanol presence underneath it, but that good candied Laffy Taffy sweetness is certainly there. And then a slight allspice kind of presence to it. Yeah, more of an allspice, potentially a little bit of fruity red fruit coming through, but I think the main dominant note there is just this like bubblegum, strawberry, Laffy Taffy kind of candied note, which is really pleasant. But that little astringency is certainly there and maybe takes the nose from something really, really solid and potentially exceptional down to just pretty good nose. All right, let's get into the palate now. Cheers, everybody. Okay, wow. Not what I was expecting in a lot of ways. I think that there was a good amount of spice and heat on it, but not overwhelming. I mean, it's 178 proof, but drinks pretty easy and has a little bit of a blooming heat to it. But that like Laffy Taffy candy note certainly there at the center of it. There's a lot of good brown sugar though, which I really love as a note, and a little bit of a touch of chocolate, I think, which I wasn't expecting at all, and a little bit of presence of age, like a woodiness and oakiness, little bit of graininess mixed in with that. So it's not like I can't pick up a little bit of youthfulness here, but it's certainly presenting as older than 2 years. So I would guess that there's older than 2 years stuff in here. That chocolate was almost like a little bit of a Tootsie Roll, and there's a cinnamon spice that goes with it. And then that candied bubblegum Laffy Taffy certainly carries through. A pretty well-balanced sip overall. Really, really pleasant overall. Easy sipper. Finish wasn't the longest experience ever, but pretty solid. But that good brown sugar, I mean, I'm always looking for a good brown sugar note, and this has got that for sure. But let's go back in now for a second sip and just see what more layers we can pick up here. Cheers, everybody. Okay. Yeah, two things came out there, I think, for me. A really nice, like, allspice, or leaning even toward like a barrel spice, like a good hefty spice to it, and a really, really solid cherry note. I think that that Laffy Taffy note on the palate, as it sits on my palate more, is becoming more of like a really nice, bright red cherry. So it's not quite so artificial and candy-like on the palate, whereas it kind of presents that way on the nose. But on the palate, it transitions to this really solid cherry, brown sugar, a little bit of allspice, and good blooming heat. Overall, just a really good, flavorful whiskey so far. Let's go back in for a third sip now. We'll focus particularly on the finish and just evaluate that this time and see how long that lasts. Cheers, everybody. Yeah, okay. So one thing I'm noticing as I go through this is just that in the center of this bourbon, right in the mid palate, it's darker and richer than I thought it would be. Mouthfeel is pretty solid overall. I guess expecting it to be a younger whiskey, their transition to their own distillate, you have that expectation it's going to be light, bright, and maybe a little youthful. But right at the core of this is some good, like, chocolate, potential Tootsie Roll, a really nice brown sugar and oak presence, and all throughout that a good cherry and vanilla kind of experience. But right at the center of it, there's just this blooming brown sugar and darkness, richness that I was not expecting. And I mean, good on them for being able to create a whiskey that has that full-bodied, well-rounded presence to it right off the bat. And I think that 107.8 proof is just, you know, it sits right in that range. I think anything like 105 to 115 can often be the sweet spot for good flavor punch, like full-bodied flavor, but not overwhelming your palate. But anyway, to go back to the finish itself, I think what lingers the most is that cherry note, a little bit of spice, and some just general vanilla sweetness. It's not the most powerful or potent finish I've ever had, but it's certainly quite good, and the fact that it's sweet makes you want to take another sip and experience that sort of cool progression of flavors once again. Anyway, I want to put this down. I want to save some for a quick comparison to Belle Meade, but on its own, Nelson Brothers Reserve Bourbon, in many ways a worthy replacement of the Belle Meade. I hope that as this distillery, Nelson Greenbrier, continues to develop, they get older stuff. I'm excited to see what they have to offer. This is a really good, coming out of the gate, offering, and just such a good and well-rounded flavor experience, good candied experience, sweet, and just really pleasant overall. Let's do a quick comparison now to Belle Meade, which got pulled out of the national market to make room for this. Okay, so now I've got the Belle Meade poured up. Just going to do a quick comparison of this glass to what we've been experiencing with the Nelson Bros Reserve. So on the nose, vanilla and sweet oak. Less of an ethanol tinge. There's a little bit of spice, but compared to the candied, Laffy Taffy, bubblegum spiciness of this Reserve version from Nelson Brothers, this MGP-sourced stuff it's just all vanilla, sweet oak, and potentially caramel. So it's a darker and richer, I would say, bourbon. Let's get into the palate and compare. Okay, so that same allspice baking spice presence is there. This one has a lot more vanilla and sweet oak like presented on the nose. It's a darker and richer experience with more caramel. That is not to say that the Nelson Brothers Reserve is bad, or I'm not even trying to say that the two are even trying to achieve the same thing. I think that the Belle Meade, why people love it so much, is that it's just classic, quintessential, rich bourbon with a good spice, lets you know that it's there and has some heft to it. And it's clear why it's a favorite of a lot of people. And that MGP older source product is just hard to beat in a lot of ways. This Nelson Brothers Reserve, though, as a younger product and its own thing now, has a lot of good candied sweetness that just makes these two very distinct. And I think if you're looking for a more candied, light experience, Nelson Brothers is going to be your jam. And if you're looking for a darker, heftier experience, the Belle Meade Reserve is something you should be going out to try to get right now before you can't get your hands on it anymore. Okay, everybody, I think that about wraps up what I have to say here today. Put in the comments below if you have experienced either of these two whiskeys or both of them. If you've experienced both, how did it come out for you? What are your comparison? What are your thoughts on Nelson Brothers coming in to kind of flood the national market while Belle Meade is pulled back to Tennessee only? Until I see you guys again for another video, all I can say is keep drinking good whiskey and cheers.